They sat there in their designer suits, smirking like they'd already won, demanding every penny of my inheritance while I stood in my dress blues like some unwanted stranger. But when I reached into my briefcase and pulled out that sealed envelope, the one they thought they'd destroyed years ago, their faces went white as sheets. By the end of that hearing, it wasn't just my money they'd lost. It was their freedom. The rain hammered against the courthouse steps as I adjusted my military cap, water dripping from the polished brim onto my pressed uniform. 3 years since I'd set foot in Millbrook, Connecticut, and nothing had changed. The same gray sky, the same cold stares, the same suffocating feeling that I'd never belonged in this picture-perfect New England town where appearances mattered more than truth. I wasn't here by choice. I was here because Staff Sergeant Alexandra Alex Morrison had been legally summoned to defend what should have been mine by right. My grandmother's estate. The woman who raised me when my own parents couldn't be bothered. The Riverside County Courthouse loomed ahead, all marble columns and carved eagles that seemed to judge everyone who walked beneath them. Through the tall windows, I could see them already seated at the plaintiff's table. Margaret and Richard Blackwood. My adoptive parents. The ones who'd taken me in at age 7, not out of love, but for the monthly checks from the state and the tax benefits that came with a quote, charitable act. They didn't even glance up when I entered the courtroom. Margaret sat perfectly poised in her cream-colored Chanel suit, pearl necklace catching the fluorescent light. Richard checked his gold Rolex with the same impatience he'd shown at every school play, every graduation, every moment that should have mattered. Their lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Harrison Wells, shuffled through papers with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he shouldn't have. I took my seat at the defendant's table, my military ribbons catching their attention for the first time. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, not with pride, but with calculation. Even now, even here, I was just another asset to be managed or a problem to be solved. The judge entered, Honorable Patricia Chen, mid-50s, known for her no-nonsense approach to family law. Her eyes swept the courtroom with practiced efficiency before settling on the matter at hand. Case number 2024, Florida 1847, the bailiff announced. Blackwood versus Morrison, contest of estate distribution. Harrison Wells stood first, his voice smooth as silk. Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of inheritance law. My clients, the Blackwoods, raised the defendant from childhood. They provided her with every advantage: private school, college tuition, a stable home environment. The deceased, Eleanor Morrison, clearly intended for her estate to benefit the family that sacrificed so much to care for her granddaughter. He gestured toward me like I was evidence in a crime scene. The defendant abandoned this family 3 years ago to pursue military service, severing all contact. She has no claim to assets intended for those who remain devoted to Eleanor Morrison's care. My jaw clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. 3 years in the Army had taught me to control my reactions, even when every word felt like a slap. Wells continued, We're asking the court to honor the true intent of the deceased and award the full estate, the house, investments, and personal property valued at $2.3 million, to the Blackwoods, who were Eleanor Morrison's true family. Judge Chen nodded and turned to me. Sergeant Morrison, you may respond. I stood slowly, my boots clicking against the polished floor. Your Honor, I have documentation that tells a very different story about the Blackwoods' devotion to my grandmother, and about why I really left home 3 years ago. Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. I request permission to present evidence that will show this case isn't about inheritance at all. It's about covering up a crime that's been hidden for over a decade. The courtroom went dead silent. Richard's hand froze halfway to his water glass. Wells jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. This is a probate hearing, not a criminal proceeding. Judge Chen raised her hand. I'll allow Sergeant Morrison to explain her position, but be warned, this court doesn't tolerate theatrics. I reached into my briefcase, my fingers brushing against the envelope I'd kept hidden for 3 years. The one they thought had been destroyed in that accidental house fire, the one that would change everything. But first, they needed to understand how we'd gotten here. How a 7-year-old orphan had become a threat that needed to be eliminated. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. This story begins when I was 17 years old, and I discovered something that my adoptive parents would kill to keep secret. Judge Chen's gavel echoed through the courthouse as she restored order to the chaos I'd just unleashed. The gallery had erupted into a frenzy of whispers and gasps, Mrs. Pemberton clutching her pearls like they might protect her from scandal. Dr. Matthews leaning forward with the hungry expression of someone who lived for gossip in their insulated social circle. Sergeant Morrison, Judge Chen said, her voice cutting through the remaining murmur, you've made some very serious allegations. I'm going to give you the opportunity to substantiate them, but I warn you, if this is some elaborate attempt to avoid an unfavorable inheritance ruling, you'll face consequences beyond losing this case. I nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Everything I'd built, my military career, my reputation, my future, hung in the balance. But some truths were too important to stay buried, no matter the personal cost. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I need to take you back to the summer of 2016. I had just turned 17, and I was spending the summer at my grandmother's estate, as I had every year since the Blackwoods took me in. Eleanor Morrison's estate sat on 12 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, a sprawling colonial revival mansion that had been in the Morrison family since 1924. 3 stories of white clapboard and black shutters, surrounded by gardens that had been featured in Better Homes and Gardens twice in the past decade. It was old money elegance at its finest. The kind of place where 5 generations of Morrisons had lived, loved, and died. But by the summer of 2016, Grandma Eleanor wasn't the woman she'd once been. At 83, she was still sharp mentally, but her body was failing. She'd had 2 small strokes the previous year, and while she'd recovered remarkably well, she tired easily and often forgot small details. It was during this vulnerable period that I first noticed how much time the Blackwoods were spending at the estate. The Blackwoods had been managing my grandmother's affairs for about 2 years at that point, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional minefield I was about to navigate. They claimed it was out of concern for her well-being, but I began to notice things that didn't add up. Quote, Margaret would arrive at the estate every Tuesday and Thursday, armed with a briefcase full of documents that needed Eleanor's signature. Financial papers, she'd say. Insurance forms. Estate planning updates. Always urgent, always requiring immediate attention. Richard would often accompany her, charming Eleanor with stories about his latest business ventures while Margaret worked through her stack of papers. At 17, I was naive about many things, but I'd learned to pay attention to details. Growing up as an outsider in the Blackwood household had taught me to watch, listen, and remember. Self-preservation demanded it. The first thing that struck me as odd was the frequency of these financial meetings, I told the court. Every week, sometimes twice a week, there would be new documents requiring my grandmother's signature. When I asked what they were for, I was told it was none of my business. Adult matters that a teenager couldn't understand. But I was curious by nature, and Margaret's condescending dismissals only made me more determined to find out what was really happening. The breakthrough came on a sweltering July afternoon, when Eleanor had fallen asleep in her garden chair after lunch. Margaret and Richard were in the study with their usual stack of papers, and I was supposed to be upstairs reading. Instead, I crept down the servants' staircase, a narrow, hidden passage that connected the upper floors to the kitchen. The old house was full of such architectural quirks, remnants of an era when wealthy families wanted their domestic staff to be invisible. I discovered most of these secret passages during my childhood summers, using them to move through the house undetected, when I wanted to avoid uncomfortable family gatherings. The servants' staircase had a peculiar acoustic property. Sound from the study carried up through the walls with startling clarity. Positioned on the landing halfway down, I could hear every word spoken in Eleanor's study as clearly as if I were in the room. How much did you transfer this time? Richard's voice, tense with barely controlled excitement. Another $50,000, Margaret replied. She signed off on the investment portfolio restructuring without even reading it. Dr. Patterson was right. The medication makes her more compliant. My blood ran cold. Dr. Patterson was Eleanor's physician, a golf buddy of Richard's who'd been managing her care since her strokes. The medication she was referring to had to be Eleanor's new anti-anxiety prescription, something Dr. Patterson had insisted she needed to, quote, manage the stress of aging. That brings us to what, 600,000 so far? Richard's voice again, and I could hear papers rustling. 623,000 to be exact, Margaret said with the precision of an accountant, plus the real estate transfers. The Hamptons property deed went through last week. On paper, she's gifting us assets to avoid estate taxes. Perfectly legal. And she doesn't remember signing the transfer documents? She remembers signing papers, but not the specifics. Dr. Patterson was right about increasing the dosage. She's much more manageable now. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid they'd hear it. They were drugging my grandmother. They were stealing from her. And they were doing it all under the guise of caring for her well-being. What about the girl? Richard asked, and I knew he meant me. What about her? Margaret's voice carried the same dismissive tone she'd always used when discussing me. She's been asking questions. About the financial meetings, about why Eleanor seems so confused lately. She's not stupid, Margaret. She notices things. There was a long pause before Margaret responded. She's 17, Richard. In 1 year, she'll be off to college, out of our hair permanently. We just need to keep her distracted until then. And if she doesn't stay distracted? Another pause, longer this time. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had taken on a chilling quality I'd never heard before. Then we'll have to make sure she understands the consequences of asking too many questions. After all, she's just a foster child. No one would believe her word against ours. And there are always other arrangements that can be made if she becomes a problem. The threat was clear, even to my 17-year-old mind. They were willing to destroy me to protect their scheme. The family that had generously taken me in was ready to throw me away the moment I became inconvenient. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated just how much I loved my grandmother, and how far I'd go to protect her. That conversation lasted another 20 minutes, I told the courtroom, my voice carrying the weight of memories I'd tried to forget. They discussed financial details, timelines, and backup plans. They talked about my grandmother like she was a business asset to be liquidated, not a human being who'd shown them nothing but kindness. Judge Chen was taking notes, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. Wells looked like a man watching his carefully constructed case collapse in real time. What did you do with this information, Sergeant Morrison? Judge Chen asked. I started documenting everything, Your Honor. Every meeting, every document, every change in my grandmother's behavior. I became a 17-year-old private investigator, and what I discovered was worse than I'd ever imagined. Over the following weeks, I developed a system. I'd position myself in various hiding spots throughout the house during Margaret and Richard's visits, using the old servant passages and the library's hidden alcove to eavesdrop on their conversations. I started a detailed journal, recording dates, times, and the substance of everything I overheard. The scope of their fraud was breathtaking. They weren't just stealing money, they were systematically transferring Eleanor's entire estate into their names. Real estate properties, investment accounts, family heirlooms, even her late husband's military medals. Everything was being gifted to them to avoid estate taxes, at least on paper. The reality was far more sinister. They'd been gradually increasing Eleanor's medication dosage, making her more compliant and confused. Dr. Patterson, it turned out, was part of the conspiracy, prescribing unnecessarily strong anti-anxiety medications and even mild sedatives under the guise of treating her agitation. I started photographing documents, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memories. The Blackwoods were careless, leaving papers scattered around the study after their meetings. Eleanor would often fall asleep in her chair, heavily medicated, while they worked. It was easy to slip in and photograph whatever they'd left behind. I'd used my phone to capture images of transfer documents, investment statements, and property deeds, page after page of evidence showing how they were systematically looting Eleanor's estate. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Richard made a critical error, I told the court. He'd been recording some of their planning sessions on his phone, probably to keep track of details for their complicated scheme. He forgot to delete one of these recordings, and it was still on his phone when he left it charging in Eleanor's kitchen one afternoon. The recording was nearly an hour long, a detailed discussion of their entire operation. They talked about forging Eleanor's signature on documents she hadn't seen, about bribing Dr. Patterson to keep her medicated, about their plans to have her declared incompetent if she ever started asking questions. But the most chilling part came near the end, when they discussed what to do about me. "The girl is becoming a liability," Margaret's voice was clear on the recording. "She's been watching us, asking Eleanor questions when we're not around. Yesterday she asked Eleanor about the Hamptons house, why she'd decided to give it away." "What did Eleanor say?" Richard's voice, tense with worry. "She didn't remember signing any papers about the Hamptons house. Started asking questions about her other properties, whether we'd been handling them properly." "Shit. We need to accelerate the timeline." "Agreed. But first, we need to neutralize the girl. She's the only one who might convince Eleanor that something's wrong." "How?" Margaret's answer made my blood run cold. "There are residential facilities for troubled teenagers. Places where asking inconvenient questions is considered a behavioral disorder. Dr. Patterson could write the necessary psychiatric evaluation. They were planning to have me committed to a psychiatric facility, to remove me from Eleanor's life permanently, leaving her defenseless against their manipulation." "I copied that recording immediately," I told the court, "along with all the documents I'd photographed and the detailed journal I'd been keeping. I knew I had evidence of massive financial fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. But I also knew that as a 17-year-old foster child with no legal standing, I'd need irrefutable proof to be taken seriously. The problem was that I was running out of time. Margaret and Richard were moving quickly now, transferring larger amounts, and making plans to have Eleanor declared incompetent. They'd also begun laying the groundwork for my removal, scheduling meetings with Dr. Patterson about my quote, 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 quote. I needed help, but I couldn't trust the local authorities. Richard played golf with the police chief. Margaret served on charity boards with half the town council. The Blackwood name carried weight in Millbrook, while I was nobody. Just a foster child with wild accusations against pillars of the community. I made the decision to contact the FBI, I told the courtroom, and I could see Wells pale visibly. Not the local police, not state authorities, but the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Financial fraud across state lines, elder abuse, conspiracy. These were federal crimes requiring federal investigation. The FBI field office in Hartford had initially been skeptical when a 17-year-old girl called claiming her adoptive parents were running a sophisticated financial fraud scheme. But the evidence I'd gathered was compelling enough to warrant a preliminary investigation. Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Judge Chen, was assigned to my case. A 15-year veteran of the Bureau's white-collar crime division, she'd seen enough elder abuse cases to recognize the patterns I described. When I played her the recording from Richard's phone, she immediately upgraded the investigation to high priority. Agent Chen instructed me to continue gathering evidence while they began their own investigation, I explained to the court. But she also warned me that I was in potential danger. If the Blackwoods suspected I was onto them, they might escalate their plans to remove me from the situation. Her warning proved prophetic. 3 days after my meeting with Agent Chen, Dr. Patterson called Margaret with urgent concerns about my psychological state. I overheard the call from my position in the servants' staircase. "She's been exhibiting signs of paranoid delusions," Dr. Patterson told Margaret, "claiming that you and Richard are plotting against Eleanor, talking about being watched and followed. Classic adolescent breakdown symptoms probably triggered by the stress of her uncertain future as she approaches adulthood." Margaret's response was swift and decisive. "What do you recommend?" "Immediate evaluation at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. I can have the commitment papers ready by tomorrow morning. With Eleanor's written consent as her guardian, we can have the girl admitted for a 72-hour evaluation that could easily be extended. And if she makes accusations against us during the evaluation, who's going to believe a mentally unstable teenager over respected members of the community? Besides, once she's in the system, her credibility is permanently damaged." I knew I had to act immediately. They were planning to have me committed the next morning, which would remove me from the picture while they completed their theft of Eleanor's estate. Once I was locked in a psychiatric facility, labeled as delusional, any evidence I'd gathered would be dismissed as the fantasies of a troubled mind. That night, I made copies of everything, I told the court. Documents, recordings, photographs, my detailed journal. I hid the originals in a safety deposit box that I'd opened using fake identification, a skill I'd learned from a friend whose father worked in document forgery. The fake ID had been surprisingly easy to obtain. One of my classmates had a side business creating false documents for underage kids who wanted to buy alcohol. For $300 in cash, money I'd saved from summer jobs, I'd acquired a driver's license that aged me to 21, allowing me to open a safety deposit box without parental consent. I also sent a complete set of copies to Agent Chen, along with a detailed letter explaining the Blackwoods' plan to have me committed. I wanted to ensure the evidence would survive even if something happened to me. The next morning proceeded exactly as I'd overheard. Dr. Patterson arrived at 8 a.m. with commitment papers that Eleanor, heavily medicated and confused, signed without reading. Margaret had convinced her that I was having emotional problems and needed professional help. But when they came to collect me for the trip to Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, I was gone. I had enlisted in the United States Army, I told the court, and I could see shock register on Margaret and Richard's faces. On my 18th birthday, which was 2 days before their planned commitment, I walked into the Army recruiting office in Hartford and signed enlistment papers. By the time they realized I was gone, I was already in basic training at Fort Moore, Georgia. The Army had been my escape route and my protection. As an active duty soldier, I was beyond the reach of local authorities and psychiatric commitment orders. The Blackwoods couldn't touch me. But my disappearance had an unintended consequence. Without me there to potentially expose their scheme, they accelerated their timeline dramatically. In the 6 months after I left for basic training, they transferred over $1 million from my grandmother's accounts, I continued. They also completed the transfer of her real estate holdings, the Hamptons house, 2 rental properties in Boston, and a commercial building in Hartford. By Christmas 2016, they had stolen virtually everything she owned. Agent Chen had kept me informed of the investigation's progress through encrypted communications. The FBI had been building a case, but they needed more time to trace the complex web of financial transactions and offshore accounts the Blackwoods had established. My sudden departure had forced the criminals to move faster than planned, which actually helped the investigation. Rapid, large-scale transfers were easier to track and harder to disguise as legitimate gifts. The Blackwoods made one final, fatal mistake, I told the court, my voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. In January 2017, they attempted to have my grandmother declared mentally incompetent so they could gain full control of her remaining assets, primarily her life insurance policies, and a trust fund that couldn't be touched without a competency hearing. The competency hearing was their downfall. To have Eleanor declared incompetent, they needed medical testimony about her mental state. Dr. Patterson was prepared to provide false testimony, but the court-appointed independent physician who examined Eleanor discovered something shocking. The independent medical examination revealed that Eleanor had been systematically over-medicated with powerful psychoactive drugs, I explained. When these medications were gradually reduced under medical supervision, her mental clarity returned almost completely. She remembered signing documents under duress, being pressured to make financial decisions while heavily sedated, and being told that I had abandoned her without explanation. Eleanor's testimony to the court-appointed physician was devastating. She described months of confusion and manipulation, of being told that her beloved granddaughter had run away because she was ungrateful and disturbed. She remembered Margaret and Richard visiting constantly with papers to sign, always when she was tired or medicated, always with urgent explanations about tax benefits and estate planning. When the FBI finally moved to arrest the Blackwoods in March 2017, they discovered that the conspiracy was even larger than we'd suspected, I continued. Dr. Patterson had been running similar schemes with other elderly patients. Margaret had used her position on various charity boards to identify potential victims. Richard had established an entire network of shell companies and offshore accounts to launder the stolen money. The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the gallery had stopped their whispered conversations, hanging on every word of my testimony. Wells looked like a man watching his career implode, while Margaret and Richard sat frozen, their carefully constructed masks of respectability finally shattered. "Your Honor," I said, reaching into my briefcase one more time, "I have here the original FBI case file, unsealed by court order for this proceeding. It contains detailed evidence of the conspiracy I've described, including the recording from Richard's phone, bank records showing the fraudulent transfers, and medical records documenting the systematic drugging of my grandmother." I placed the thick manila envelope on the table in front of me. It also contains something else. The real reason the Blackwoods are so desperate to win this inheritance case, and why they've spent 3 years trying to discredit me. Judge Chen leaned forward. "And what would that be, Sergeant Morrison?" I met her gaze steadily. "Evidence that they never stopped stealing from my grandmother, Your Honor. Even after the FBI investigation, even after they posted bail and were awaiting trial, they continued to systematically loot her estate. And they've been using the money they stole to pay for their legal defense and maintain their lifestyle while claiming to be the victims of a vindictive foster child." The explosion of sound from the gallery was immediate and deafening. Mrs. Pemberton actually stood up, pointing an accusing finger at the Blackwoods. Dr. Matthews was shaking his head in apparent disbelief. The reporters who'd been quietly taking notes suddenly sprang into action, frantically scribbling or typing on their phones. But all I could focus on were Margaret and Richard's faces. For the first time since I'd known them, they looked genuinely afraid. And I still hadn't shown them the document that would destroy them completely. Judge Chen's gavel cut through the chaos like a blade, but it took several minutes for the courtroom to settle into something resembling order. The revelation that the Blackwoods had continued stealing even while under federal investigation had sent shockwaves through Millbrook's elite social circle. Mrs. Pemberton was fanning herself with her program, Drive. Matthews was frantically texting someone, probably his wife, with the gossip of the century, and the reporters in the back were already crafting headlines that would destroy the Blackwood reputation forever. But in the eye of this storm sat Margaret and Richard, their faces masks of barely controlled terror. They knew I had more evidence. They could see it in my eyes, in the way I carefully handled that sealed envelope, in the confidence that radiated from my military bearing. For the first time in their privileged lives, they were truly powerless. "Sergeant Morrison," Judge Chen said once relative quiet had been restored, "you've presented serious allegations with what appears to be substantial documentation. However, this is still fundamentally an inheritance dispute. How does this evidence relate to the matter before this court?" It was the perfect opening, the question I'd been waiting for. "Your Honor, the connection is simple but devastating," I replied, standing at attention as I'd been trained. "The Blackwoods aren't just fighting for my grandmother's inheritance. They're fighting to avoid prison. And they need that inheritance money to pay back what they've stolen before the federal prosecutors realize the full scope of their crimes." I reached for the sealed envelope, my fingers steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. This document proves that their theft didn't end with the FBI investigation. It proves they've been systematically looting my grandmother's estate right up until her death last month. And it proves they committed murder to cover their tracks. The word murder hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Wells shot to his feet so fast he knocked over his water glass, sending liquid cascading across his legal papers. "Objection!" Wells shouted, his composed demeanor finally cracking. "Your Honor, this is completely beyond the scope of—" "Overruled," Judge Chen cut him off, her eyes fixed on me with laser intensity. "Sergeant Morrison, you've made an extremely serious accusation. I'm going to allow you to present your evidence, but I'm also going to warn you that if you cannot substantiate a murder allegation, you'll face criminal charges for perjury and defamation." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "I understand, Your Honor, and I can substantiate everything." Quote. I broke the seal on the envelope with deliberate care, watching as Margaret's face went from pale to gray. She knew what was inside. She had to know. "This envelope contains the original copy of my grandmother's real will," I said, holding up a thick document bound in blue legal backing. Not the forged version the Blackwoods submitted to probate, but the actual last will and testament that Eleanor Morrison signed 6 weeks before her death. The courtroom erupted again, but I continued speaking over the noise. It also contains her signed confession detailing the Blackwoods crimes, written in her own hand when she realized they were planning to kill her. Margaret made a sound, half gasp, half moan, and slumped in her chair. Richard's face had gone completely white, but his eyes burned with a fury I'd never seen before. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced enemy fire and lived, "my grandmother didn't die of natural causes as the death certificate claims. She was murdered because she discovered the full extent of the Blackwoods theft and was preparing to expose them." Judge Chen was taking rapid notes, her judicial composure intact, but her eyes showing the shock she was trying to conceal. "Proceed, Sergeant Morrison." I unfolded the first document, Eleanor's real will, dated 6 weeks before her death. My grandmother's actual will leaves everything to me, as the Blackwoods claimed. But it also contains specific instructions about what to do with evidence she'd been gathering about their crimes. I began reading from the document. "To my beloved granddaughter Alexandra Morrison, I leave my entire estate with the knowledge that she will use it wisely and justly. I also leave her the responsibility of ensuring that Margaret and Richard Blackwood face justice for their crimes against me and others. In the safe deposit box at First National Bank of Hartford, box number 1247, she will find evidence of systematic theft, forgery, and conspiracy that spans more than 5 years." The gallery was dead silent now, everyone straining to hear every word. "If anything happens to me before this will can be properly executed," I continued reading, "Alexandra should know that it was not an accident. The Blackwoods have threatened me multiple times when I've questioned their management of my affairs. They believe I am too old and confused to understand what they're doing, but I am neither old nor confused enough to let them destroy my family's legacy." I looked up from the document to see tears streaming down Margaret's face. Not tears of grief, but tears of terror. "But this will wasn't the most damning thing my grandmother left me," I said, setting aside the legal document and reaching for a handwritten letter. 3 days before her death, Eleanor Morrison wrote a detailed confession, describing exactly how the Blackwoods were planning to kill her. The letter was in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting, elegant script that remained steady despite her age. I'd had the handwriting authenticated by 3 different experts, and their reports were included in my evidence file. "My dear Alexandra," I read aloud, "if you are reading this, then Richard and Margaret have succeeded in their plan to murder me. I am writing this in secret, hiding it where only you would think to look, because I know they monitor my communications and have bribed my staff to report on my activities." Wells was frantically shuffling through papers, looking for some legal precedent that could stop this testimony, but Judge Chen was completely focused on my reading. "They believe I don't understand what they've been doing, but I've been aware of their theft for months. I've been pretending to be more confused than I am, gathering evidence of their crimes while letting them think they're successfully manipulating me. The safe deposit box contains bank records, forged documents, and recordings I've made of their conversations." I paused, letting the weight of my grandmother's words sink in, but then she describes their murder plan in detail. "They've been increasing my medication again, working with Dr. Patterson to make it look like natural decline. But yesterday, I overheard them discussing something they called the final solution. Richard said they couldn't wait any longer, that you might return from military service soon and start asking questions. Margaret suggested making it look like I fell in the bathroom, but Richard said that was too risky with the staff around." Margaret was sobbing now, her carefully composed facade completely destroyed. Richard sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "They've decided to use an insulin overdose," I continued reading. "Dr. Patterson will inject me with a massive dose during my regular Tuesday appointment, then claim I suffered diabetic shock. Since I'm not actually diabetic, no one will think to test for insulin unless they suspect foul play. And who would suspect Margaret and Richard of murdering the woman who made them millionaires?" The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the rain still pattering against the windows. Even the reporters had stopped writing, transfixed by the horror of what they were hearing. "Your Honor," I said, setting down the letter, "my grandmother died on a Tuesday evening, supposedly of diabetic shock, despite never having been diagnosed with diabetes. Dr. Patterson was the attending physician who pronounced her dead and signed the death certificate without ordering an autopsy. I reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a small plastic vial. This contains a sample of my grandmother's blood that she drew herself and hid in her bedroom safe before her final doctor's appointment. She was a nurse during the Korean War. She knew how to draw blood, and she knew it would preserve evidence of any drugs in her system. Judge Chen leaned forward. Has this blood sample been tested? Yes, Your Honor, by 3 independent laboratories. I handed her the lab reports. All 3 found massive levels of insulin, enough to kill someone 3 times her size. The reports also found traces of sedatives that weren't prescribed to her, and evidence of a paralytic agent that would have prevented her from calling for help. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Wells looked like he wanted to object but couldn't find the words. Margaret had collapsed completely, her head in her hands. Richard was staring at me with undisguised hatred. But the most damning evidence, I said, pulling out a small digital recorder, is this. My grandmother managed to record her final conversation with Dr. Patterson. Judge Chen nodded grimly. Play it. I pressed play, and my grandmother's voice filled the courtroom, weak but clear, unmistakably hers. Dr. Patterson, I know what you're planning to do, her voice said through the small speaker. Mrs. Morrison, I don't know what you mean, came the doctor's reply, but his voice was nervous. The insulin, doctor? I know Margaret and Richard have paid you to kill me with an insulin injection. I want you to know that I'm aware of the plan, and I've left evidence that will expose all of you. Mrs. Morrison, you're confused. Your medication sometimes causes paranoid thoughts. I'm not confused, and I'm not paranoid, Eleanor's voice cut him off. I'm a woman who's about to be murdered by people I trusted. I want you to look me in the eye when you do it. I want you to know that I know exactly what you're doing and why. There was a long pause before Dr. Patterson spoke again, his voice now cold and professional. Margaret said you might become difficult. She was right. Tell me why, Eleanor's voice, still strong despite everything. Tell me why you're willing to murder an innocent woman for money. Because innocent women don't live in $12 million estates while people like me struggle to pay off medical school loans, Patterson replied. Because the world won't miss one more rich old lady who never worked a day in her life. And because, came Richard's voice, suddenly joining the conversation, she's finally figured out that we've been robbing her blind for 5 years. The recording continued for another minute, with Richard and Dr. Patterson discussing the technical details of the murder while my grandmother listened to her own death sentence. When it ended, the courtroom remained in absolute silence. Judge Chen was the first to speak. Sergeant Morrison, when did this recording take place? Tuesday, April 15, 2024, at approximately 2:30 p.m. My grandmother died that evening at 7:45 p.m., officially of diabetic shock. I looked directly at Margaret and Richard. But she didn't die immediately after the injection. She lived long enough to call me. That revelation sent another shock through the courtroom. I pulled out my phone and showed Judge Chen the call log. At 7:38 p.m. that evening, I received a call from my grandmother's private line. She was dying, but she managed to tell me where she'd hidden the evidence and to confirm that Dr. Patterson had injected her with insulin as planned. I played the voicemail she'd left when I couldn't answer in time. I'd been in a training exercise and couldn't take the call. Eleanor's voice came through my phone speaker, weak and labored. Alexandra, my darling girl, they've done it. Dr. Patterson gave me the injection just like they planned. I can feel it working. I hid everything in the blue music box in my bedroom, the one that plays For Elise. The real will, the confession, the blood sample, all of it. Make them pay, sweetheart. Make them pay for what they've done. Quote. The message ended with the sound of the phone dropping, presumably as Eleanor lost consciousness. Margaret was making keening sounds now, rocking back and forth in her chair. Richard looked like a statue, his face carved from stone but his eyes burning with helpless rage. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of everything I'd just revealed. I returned from deployment immediately and found all the evidence exactly where my grandmother said it would be. I also contacted the FBI, who began a murder investigation. Dr. Patterson was arrested last week and has already agreed to testify against the Blackwoods in exchange for a reduced sentence. Judge Chen set down her pen and looked directly at Margaret and Richard. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you wish to respond? Wells tried to stand, but Richard grabbed his arm and shook his head. For a moment, it looked like Richard might try to maintain their innocence. But then Margaret broke completely. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she sobbed. She was supposed to die peacefully. The insulin was supposed to work faster. She wasn't supposed to suffer. Margaret, shut up, Richard hissed, but it was too late. She was going to ruin everything, Margaret continued, the words pouring out of her like a confession at a deathbed. She'd figured out about the money, about the properties we'd transferred. She was going to call the FBI and have us arrested. We'd already spent most of what we'd taken. The legal fees, the house in the Caymans, Richard's gambling debts. We couldn't pay it back. Mrs. Blackwood, Wells said desperately, I strongly advise you to... Shut up! Margaret screamed at her own lawyer. It's over. Don't you understand? It's all over. She turned to look at me, her face streaked with tears and mascara. You were supposed to stay away. You were supposed to disappear into the military and never come back. Why couldn't you just leave us alone? I met her gaze steadily. Because she was my grandmother, and she loved me, something you never understood. Richard finally found his voice. You sanctimonious little bitch. You think you're so much better than us, but you're nothing. You're nobody. A foster kid who got lucky. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Chen said sharply, I suggest you remain silent. But Richard was beyond caring about legal advice. We gave you everything. A home, an education, opportunities you never would have had. And this is how you repay us? By destroying the family that saved you from the gutter? I smiled then, not with malice, but with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally heard the truth spoken aloud. You never saved me from anything, Richard. You used me as a prop in your social climbing scheme, and when I became inconvenient, you tried to have me committed to a psychiatric hospital. The only person who ever loved me in this family was the woman you murdered for her money. Judge Chen banged her gavel as the courtroom erupted again. Order! I'll have order in this courtroom. When silence returned, she turned to the bailiffs standing at the back of the room. Officers, please place Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood under arrest for murder in the first degree, conspiracy, elder abuse, and financial fraud. The next few minutes passed in a blur of chaos. Margaret was still sobbing as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Richard tried to maintain some dignity as he was arrested, but his face was a mask of defeat and fury. Wells was frantically arguing with the arresting officers about procedure and his client's rights. As the Blackwoods were led away in handcuffs, Margaret turned back one last time. We loved her too, she said, her voice broken. In our way, we loved Eleanor. I shook my head. No, you didn't. If you'd loved her, you would never have been able to look her in the eyes while you murdered her. The courtroom slowly emptied as the drama concluded. The reporters rushed out to file their stories. The society matrons of Millbrook fled to avoid being associated with the scandal. Dr. Matthews looked like he was reconsidering every golf game he'd ever played with Richard. Judge Chen remained at her bench, finishing her notes. When the room was nearly empty, she looked up at me. Sergeant Morrison, this court awards you the full inheritance, as specified in Eleanor Morrison's legitimate will. More importantly, you've ensured that justice was served for your grandmother. I nodded, but the money felt irrelevant now. Thank you, Your Honor. What will you do now? She asked. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about her request that I use the inheritance wisely and justly. I'm going to establish a foundation to help other elderly people who are being abused by family members. And I'm going to make sure that other foster children don't fall through the cracks the way I almost did. Judge Chen smiled, the first genuine emotion she'd shown all day. I think your grandmother would approve. As I walked out of the courthouse, the rain had stopped and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. 3 years of military service had taught me that justice doesn't always come quickly, but when it does arrive, it can be absolutely devastating to those who deserve it. I thought about Eleanor's final words to me, her request that I make them pay for what they'd done. Mission accomplished, Grandma. Mission accomplished. But more than that, I'd learned something important about family. Real family isn't about blood relations or legal documents. It's about people who love you unconditionally, who believe in you when others don't, and who leave you with the tools to fight for what's right. Eleanor Morrison had given me more than an inheritance. She'd given me justice, truth, and the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge is simply revealing who people really are. The Blackwoods would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Dr. Patterson would serve time as an accessory to murder. And I would use Eleanor's money to make sure that other vulnerable people didn't suffer the same fate. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes the good guys win. And sometimes, when you produce the right document at the right moment, you can watch 30 years of lies collapse in a single afternoon. As I drove away from Millbrook for the last time, I could see the Blackwood mansion in my rearview mirror, empty now, soon to be seized by federal marshals as part of the criminal restitution. Justice had been served, the truth had been revealed, and Eleanor Morrison could finally rest in peace. The foster child they'd tried to discard had grown up to become their worst nightmare, someone with the courage to tell the truth and the evidence to prove it. And in the end, that was all it took to destroy them completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.